We're taking a look at what summers really looked like in 1980s Britain, and it might surprise you more than finding out your dad's mullet was actually considered fashionable. Let's roll back the years. Unemployment hitting 3.3 million, miners' strikes dominating headlines, and yet somehow British summers were absolutely magical. You think Instagram perfect holidays are something new? Think again. But here's the twist nobody talks about. While Thatcher's Britain was supposedly all doom and gloom, ordinary Brits were secretly having the time of their lives, creating a summer culture so revolutionary it would make today's festivals look like village fetes. From illegal warehouse raves that birthed an entire music movement to package holidays that turned working-class families into jet-setters overnight, the 80s summer paradox was real. The harder life got, the harder Britain partied. Let me paint you a picture that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about 1980s Britain. While the news was banging on about economic recession, industrial decline, and social unrest, something rather extraordinary was happening in car parks, fields, and coastal towns across the nation. British summers were undergoing a transformation that would define an entire generation. The atmosphere of 80s summers was like living in two different countries simultaneously. On one hand, you had mass unemployment. We're talking dole queues stretching around corners like they were giving away free Duran Duran tickets. The miners' strike of 1984 to 85 had torn communities apart, and inner-city riots in Brixton and Toxteth had shown the ugly underbelly of Thatcher's Britain. Yet somehow, against this backdrop of industrial decay and social tension, British summers bloomed with an almost defiant optimism. It was as if the entire nation had collectively decided that if everything was going to pot anyway, they might as well have a bloody good time doing it. If you're enjoying this trip down memory lane already, do us a favour and hit that subscribe button, because I'm about to reveal some absolutely mental facts about 80s summers that your nostalgia-filtered memory has conveniently forgotten. Like how your parents probably broke more laws during one summer than you have in your entire life. The transformation of working-class summer culture in the 80s was nothing short of revolutionary. Package holidays, which had started creeping in during the 70s, exploded into a full-blown phenomenon. Suddenly, families who'd never left Yorkshire were sipping sangria in Benidorm, getting sunburnt to a crisp, and coming back with sombreros they'd never wear again. Here's a fact that'll blow your mind. In 1980, only about 20% of Brits had been abroad for a holiday. By 1989, that number had nearly doubled. Thomson Holidays and Thomas Cook were practically printing money, offering all-inclusive packages to Spain for less than £100. That's right, less than a ton for a week in the sun, including flights, hotel, and enough cheap booze to forget Maggie Thatcher existed. The social impact was profound. Entire streets would empty as neighbours coordinated their holidays to travel together. The phenomenon of the Benidorm street became real. You'd find more residents from certain Manchester estates in particular Spanish resorts than back home during August. These weren't just holidays, they were cultural exchanges in reverse. British-themed pubs sprouted across the Costas, faster than you could say, full English breakfast, complete with Union Jack bunting and screenings of Coronation Street. The irony of travelling 1,500 miles to eat egg and chips while watching British telly was completely lost on everyone involved, and that's what made it brilliant. But it wasn't just about escaping Britain. The domestic summer scene was evolving too. Butlin's holiday camps, those bastions of British seaside culture, were trying desperately to compete with the Costa del Sol by installing wave machines and tropical-themed bars. Billy Butlin himself would have choked on his knobbly knees competition trophy if he'd seen what his camps had become. Less hi-de-hi and more I. For children of the 80s, summers were a strange cocktail of traditional seaside nostalgia and emerging technology. British beaches from Blackpool to Brighton were packed with families armed with nothing more than a windbreak, some soggy sandwiches, and enough optimism to ignore the North Sea's Arctic temperatures. The Norfolk Broads became an unexpected summer playground. Families who couldn't afford Spain would hire a boat for a week, chugging along at 4 miles per hour, pretending they were exploring the Amazon, rather than avoiding floating shopping trolleys. Kids would spend hours crabbing off rickety jetties with bacon tied to string. convinced they'd caught jaws every time they pulled up a spider crab the size of a 10-pence piece. But here's where it gets interesting and slightly controversial. While modern parents panic about screen time, 80s kids were experiencing the first wave of portable entertainment. The Sony Walkman had arrived and suddenly every kid wanted one. Parents would fork out £150, about £500 in today's money, for a device that did nothing but play cassette tapes. Mental, when you think about it. The beach economy for kids was fascinating. Entrepreneurs as young as 8 would patrol beaches selling everything from homemade lemonade to lucky shells they'd collected that morning. Beach talent shows were serious business. Every coastal town had its own junior showtime where kids would murder fame or attempt breakdancing on concrete that would leave them looking like they'd been attacked by a cheese grater. Prize money could be as much as £5, which in kid currency was enough to fund an entire summer's worth of arcade addiction. These competitions were breeding grounds for future X Factor contestants, though considerably more charming and with significantly less auto-tune. Seaside arcades were undergoing their own revolution. Out went the penny falls and mechanical fortune tellers. In came Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Donkey Kong. Kids would blow their entire holiday pocket money in about 30 minutes, mesmerized by pixels moving across a screen. Parents tutted about waste of money while secretly having a go themselves when the kids weren't looking. The ice cream wars of the 80s deserve their own Netflix documentary. Mr. Whippyvans would patrol beaches like territorial gangs, their tinny renditions of Greensleeves becoming the soundtrack to summer. A 99 flake cost 35 pence, and yes, they really did use proper Cadbury's flakes back then, not the disappointing substitutes you get today. Now, this is where things get properly mental. If you were a teenager or young adult in late 80s Britain, your summers were about to be turned upside down by two completely different but equally seismic cultural shifts. First, let's talk about the elephant in the field, the second summer of love in 1988. While Radio 1 was still playing 5 Star and Johnny Hates Jazz, something extraordinary was happening in warehouses, fields, and motorway service stations across Britain. Acid House had arrived, and with it came a summer revolution that would make Woodstock look like a church picnic. The scale of these illegal raves was staggering. We're talking about 25,000 people descending on a farmer's field with nothing but word-of-mouth directions and a pirate radio frequency. No tickets, no security, no bloody health and safety assessments, just pure, unadulterated hedonism. The Sunrise Mystery Trip in June 1989 saw 11,000 ravers following a convoy to a secret location, like some sort of techno pilgrimage. The establishment absolutely lost their minds. The tabloids ran headlines about evil acid house and ban this killer music, while completely missing the point that for the first time in British history, working-class kids from Manchester were hugging public schoolboys from Surrey in a field at 6 a.m. Class barriers? They dissolved faster than... Well, let's not go there. Meanwhile, for those seeking their thrills in a slightly more legal fashion, Alton Towers was transforming from a genteel country estate with a few fairground rides into a proper theme park. The Corkscrew, Britain's first double-loop roller coaster, had opened in 1980, and suddenly every teenager in the Midlands was spending their summers queuing for 2 hours to be thrown upside down for 90 seconds. But here's a fact that'll make you feel proper old. The Black Hole, that legendary indoor roller coaster, opened in 1984 and cost £4 million to build. Teenagers would travel from all over Britain just to ride in complete darkness while status quo blasted through hidden speakers. It was closed in 2005 and replaced by a bloody CBeebies land. If that doesn't sum up how Britain's changed, nothing does. What I'm about to tell you might shock you, especially if you were one of the thousands who spent their summers in a field off the M25. But first, if you're reliving your misspent youth right now, smash that like button. Trust me, this story gets even wilder. While the youth were losing their minds to repetitive beats, British adults had their own summer revolution happening, though admittedly at a more leisurely pace and with considerably more clothes on. The The Great British Pub Garden reached its absolute zenith in the 1980s. This was before the smoking ban, before gastropubs, before craft beer made everything complicated. A pint of bitter cost about 60 pence, and beer gardens were essentially car parks with picnic tables where you could smoke yourself silly while your kids ran feral on a climbing frame held together by rust and hope. But here's where it gets interesting. The 1980s saw the birth of the continental pub. Suddenly, establishments that had served nothing but pork scratchings since the Norman conquest were installing parasols and serving something called lager and lime. Pubs started having European nights where they'd serve Pimm's and pretend their back garden was actually the French Riviera. Sports became a massive part of adult summer culture, but not in the way you might think. Yes, cricket was still cricket, and yes, village greens still hosted matches where more sandwiches were consumed than runs were scored. But the 80s saw the explosion of fun sports that required minimal skill and maximum alcohol consumption. Pub volleyball leagues sprang up everywhere. Picture this: overweight blokes in terry toweling shorts attempting to spike a ball while holding a pint, usually ending up flat on their faces in a sandpit that hadn't been raked since 1982. It was glorious carnage. The company sports day became a summer institution. Every factory, office and shop in Britain suddenly decided they needed an annual day where Derek from accounts could prove he was still athletic by pulling a hamstring in the father's race. These events were essentially excuses for day drinking disguised as team building, and they were bloody brilliant. Now, I promised you controversial information, and here's where things get a bit darker than your average nostalgia trip. The 1980s summer wasn't all Soleros and synthesizers. Football hooliganism was at its absolute peak. The 1985 European Cup final at Heysel Stadium saw 39 people die when Liverpool fans charged at Juventus supporters. English clubs were banned from European competition for 5 years. Summer football tours became synonymous with violence, and the image of the British tourist began its transformation from polite tea drinker to lager-fueled lout. The Costa del Crime wasn't just a tabloid invention. The Spanish costas became a haven for British criminals escaping justice, creating a parallel universe where wanted bank robbers ran British pubs and drug dealers organised quiz nights. Marbella became so notorious that the Spanish authorities launched Operation Captura, specifically targeting British fugitives. The same beaches where families built sandcastles by day became meeting points for some of Britain's most wanted by night. It was this strange duality that defined 80s summers, innocence and criminality existing literally side by side, separated only by a beach parasol and a plate of paella. The Strangeways prison riot of April 1990, technically spring but its effects lasted all summer, saw prisoners protesting conditions by staging a 25-day occupation of the prison roof. In the blazing sunshine, inmates could be seen sunbathing on the roof while negotiating with authorities. It was surreal, dystopian and uniquely British. Where else would prisoners protest by having a rooftop barbecue? Environmental awareness was practically non-existent. Those cheap package holidays? They were powered by airlines with the carbon footprint of small countries. Factor 50 sun cream? Not a chance. British skin was offered up to the sun like sacrificial bacon, with olive oil being considered adequate protection. The hole in the ozone layer was discovered in 1985, but British holidaymakers carried on burning themselves to a crisp with admirable dedication to tradition. As the 1980s drew to a close, British summers would never be the same again. The Criminal Justice Act of 1994 would kill off the rave scene. Budget airlines would make those £99 package holidays look expensive. Health and safety would ensure that dodgy fairground rides and rusty playground equipment became extinct. The transformation was gradual but devastating. By 1990, the first mobile phones were appearing on beaches, their owners shouting into bricks the size of house bricks about being on holiday. The innocent anonymity of pre-digital summers was ending. Credit cards replaced travelers' checks, CCTV cameras sprouted on seaside promenades, and the spontaneous chaos that defined 80s summers became increasingly regulated. The entertainments increased penalties. Act 1990 introduced massive fines for unlicensed events, effectively criminalising the very spontaneity that made the decade special. Even Punch and Judy shows needed public liability insurance. The bureaucratisation of fun had begun, and British summers would never recover their anarchic spirit. But for one glorious decade, British summers existed in a perfect sweet spot between post-war austerity and modern anxiety. It was a time when freedom meant something different. Not the curated, Instagram-perfect freedom of today, but something raw, more dangerous, more real. Your parents might tell you summers were better in their day. And you know what? They might have a point. Not because the weather was better, it wasn't, or because things were simpler, they weren't, but because for a brief moment in history, Britain learned how to party like the world was ending, which, given the political climate, it very well might have been. If this trip through 1980s British summers has given you feelings you haven't had since you last heard Pump Up the Volume on a proper sound system, then do yourself a favour and hit that subscribe button below. We'll be diving into more forgotten corners of British history, the weird, the wonderful, and the slightly illegal. Next week, we're exploring why British TV in the 90s was simultaneously the best and worst thing ever created. Until then, dust off your shell suit, stick on some Yazoo, and remember, you're only as old as the last time you attempted the time warp at a wedding.